This is a Macintosh Plus, and I'm kind of the wrong person to talk to about Mac stuff. But there was a sort of myth that I wanted to disprove around these, because despite the disk being white and looking original in there, that is in fact not an original Apple operating system disk. This was supposed to be TurboTax. I wrote this disk using a Greaseweazle and a standard PC floppy drive. And today I'm going to cover how you can do that, why this works out just fine, and why the answer to being able to do that is realistically just this. Okay, hopefully that was a shocking enough intro to make this second channel video seem at least a little more than average. So this is a Greaseweazle 4.2, if I remember correctly. It's the USB-C one, and we will be taking advantage of that in a moment. But over the last week or so, the DigiPress disk archiving page has been making the rounds on the internet, and I saw that, and there was one thing in there that I disagreed with, and I can demonstrate why it's not quite accurate. But they highly recommend that you use an applesauce to write Mac disks when it just shouldn't be necessary, because the Greaseweazle has all of the controls necessary to be able to write Macintosh formatted disks. Now, many people will think of the GCR and the variable disk RPM as reasons that you cannot use a Greaseweazle or a PC floppy drive, but those don't actually matter. GCR is just the data encoding scheme that is held within each sector. It has nothing to do with the larger disk format. Now, the other main thing that people think of is that a PC drive runs at a fixed RPM, and the Apple drive has a variable RPM control where it will change, I think, between 3 different speeds as the head moves in or out of the disk. And the Sony MFD 51W that's in here, which, by the way, there were never really any great pictures of, so I went ahead and put some up on my wiki, so there you go. Now we actually have good pictures of that drive. Now, as I mentioned, GCR is the sector encoding scheme. The variable track speed is actually known as zone bit recording, where the sector density is different between tracks on a disk. And that has nothing to do with the drive speed. Commodore 64 disks use zone bit recording with a fixed RPM, just like a PC drive. And the way you do that is by just changing how fast your controller reads or writes to the disk instead of changing how fast the media spins. So you can achieve the exact same thing as changing the drive RPM by just changing the data rate that you access the disk at with the controller. And that's where disk definitions come in with the Greaseweazle. But to make that make sense, let's move over to a computer so that I can show you what it has going on. All right, now I'm gonna go ahead and connect my Greaseweazle to a computer because we're not really doing anything with it here. And as I'm doing this, let me just quickly describe the setup here. So again, this is a Greaseweazle 4.2, I think. And I have this passing through power to my floppy drive using this cable. This is actually the cable from a Pico PSU, so I'm using an amp mate and lock to Burge power connector to plug in a Sony MPF 920. This is an extremely common floppy drive made in 2004. So these are very, very easy to find and source, and that's going to be important later. Now I'm gonna go ahead and plug this in, but you will notice that nothing happens and nothing comes to life, because one of my favorite things that I use is a individually power controllable USB hub. So now there's an LED on the Greaseweazle and the drive has power. From here, I can go ahead and put my disk in, but we're gonna wait a moment for that. Now, with the Greaseweazle connected to the computer, I want to show you the overwhelming number of disk formats that this thing supports. All of these are different systems and disk structures that you can read or write with the Greaseweazle, and this includes the 400 and 800K Mac formats. That's because the way the Greaseweazle works is by having disk definitions, and this is part of the Greaseweazle source code, where each individual track or section of tracks or data layout can be defined, and things like the clock rate per zone here is defined. So when the disk is read or written to, it knows how to structure the data. This variable clock speed is how the Greaseweazle is able to support zone bit recording with a fixed RPM disk drive. This makes it so that it doesn't have to change the disk speed because it changes the read and write speed. This is only possible because the Greaseweazle is not a standard floppy controller. It is quite literally a microcontroller plugged into the floppy drive that completely arbitrarily drives the floppy drive to do whatever it wants with it. Whatever rules or preconceptions you have about how PC drives work go out the window when you plug them into a Greaseweazle. So knowing this, let's take a look at something. These are disk images from WinWorld of System 5 for that Mac Plus over there. We're going to work with System Tools 1 here, which is the boot disk. This is a double density floppy disk, and these are actually kind of hard to find in the 3.5-inch form factor. It's way easier to find 5.25-inch double density disks, but 3.5 double density had a very short time on the market before it was replaced by high density, and there just aren't a lot of them out there, and they're not very good when they are. So that's the first thing I'm going to point out as being important, is that you need a double density disk that is in really good shape to be able to do this. And that might be true for using an applesauce as well. I don't know. But that's one thing that I want to point out. But the other thing is that how blank the disk is really matters. Now, before we continue, I'm going to go ahead and write the original data that was on this disk, a super exciting copy of TurboTax, so that you can see what happens when you don't wipe the disk first. All right. The disk is written, and I'm not even going to bother to read it back because it doesn't actually matter. What I really wanted on there was just some random garbage data. Going back to the Apple disks now, I'm going to do the same kind of write command, but before we specify the file, I'm going to specify the format so that it knows to use the Mac zone bit recording format on this disk. But with this, we should be able to write this floppy. However, I suspect it will fail around track 48. And, oh, that's interesting. It's actually going to make it. Well, let me explain this. So around track 48 of the zone bit format that the Mac disks use, the clock speed is getting higher and it's becoming more sensitive to changes in how the data is written. We get this again after track 64, and I've seen it more on track 65 where the issues start to happen. You know what? Let me just grab another disk. All right, there we go. I had to cheat a little bit to make it happen, but there is a disk failing to write in Apple zone bit recording format in a PC drive. Now, the reason that it failed is that this is a pre-formatted PC disk. And what's going on is when it gets to this clock rate in the zone bit format, it is not able to properly blank out the tracks on this disk before trying to write the Mac ones. Now, I've encountered this with a lot of drives. One of the things that I've actually been doing here is going through and testing a ton of different 3.5-inch drives. And I will link below to a list of drives that I tried that did and did not work with this. But the thing is that every drive that did work worked perfectly fine with this after I did this. This is a Radio Shack bulk tape eraser or bulk magnetic eraser. What this does is use just straight up a transformer to create a lot of spurious flux transitions that you can use to wipe out a disk. Now, if we imaged this disk and then viewed it in HXC or something, we would just see nothing but red because there's no data structure on this disk now because I just wiped it. All right, now because this is a high density disk, it's not really going to be well suited for this to begin with. So I'm gonna go ahead and go back to a double density disk here, and I will run this command and you'll see now it will work just fine. Although I should demagnetize this again just to be sure. By the way, that noise is only happening because of the shutter and the hub on here. If I pinch those, you'll notice it's totally silent. And there we are, cruising through track 48 onto the rest of the disk. All right, we'll test this disk in a moment, but before we continue, I want to use the other disk that I have And I want to demonstrate what an incompatible drive looks like. This is a Panasonic JU256A216P, and it can't write Mac discs for some reason. Now I'm just gonna turn off my USB hub and swap over my cables to this drive. The Greaseweazle, not changing, just the drive is. And for the record, all of these drives have been cleaned using isopropyl and a proper disk cleaning tool. That's not the problem. The problem is the drive itself and will become very immediately obvious. All right, with my freshly blanked drive and the USB hub on, if I try to write this disk, we get errors immediately on track 0. It's not like the other drives where it fails part way into the disk. Now, there's speculation that certain eras of drive, and this Alps drives included, contain pulse shaping electronics for the flux transitions. That would result in cleaner disks that are just meant for PCs, but it means that we have less direct control over how these drives are able to read and write other disks. I would actually use this personally as a way of testing whether or not a drive is suitable for archiving at all, because if it's got weird stuff going on like that, I don't think it's a good drive to be using for this. So I actually kind of like that this is highlighted, that a few drives are not going to be as adaptable, because I'm going to take those out of the running for use with the Greaseweazle at all. And I'll probably just put these in PCs so that they can just read their boring FAT12 formatted disks until the end of their days. Now to demonstrate though, let me take that freshly written disk that we did with that was actually a TIAC FD235HF here, and see that that works correctly on the Mac. All right, turn this on. For the record, I actually did a couple of streams getting this computer up and running. The only thing I had to do was relubricate the floppy drive. The gear hadn't been sheared because I hadn't been used in a long time, so I was able to prevent that from happening. All right, but with the freshly written TurboTax disk here, I can pop that in and it's gonna boot nice and happy. There we go. Now, during the boot process, if there are issues with the disk, it will actually throw up an error message that says, this disk needs repaired or something. But there's another way that we can verify that the disk is good that I will go ahead and demonstrate to you now. Back over at the modern PC, I need to first swap out that bad Panasonic drive. And for kicks, let me throw on a Mitsumi D359M3D, which is another somewhat common drive that also works for this. Keep in mind, by the way, that if you're doing loose floating drives like this, some of them will have a loose disk motor like that, and you need to make sure that you don't accidentally stop that, because that will cause some issues for you as well. First, I would like to mention that the Greaseweazle checks the disk as it is being written. We can see all tracks verified, and when it failed earlier, it actually said verify failure. This is because it writes the disk and then immediately reads it back to make sure that the data that it wrote is correct. But if you don't trust it, you can just go complete full circle and make sure that the disk that it writes is exactly the same as the one that you read from. So to do this, we're going to go up and we're going to do a read command in the Mac format here. And we're just going to read to test, and then we will check the checksum between the image I'm going to read back from the disk and the one that I initially wrote it from. And this is interesting here because we can see the number of sectors drop as we get farther into the disk. Over here, we should be able to see something along the lines of how many sectors there are. So sectors 12, 11, 10, 9, and 8. So we're in the 10 sector track. Dropping down to 9. Such a weird way to do it. All right, there we go. So sectors found 1600 out of 1600, and you can see how it does its wonky Apple thing. But up here, let's go ahead and grab the original image, do a checksum on that, and then I will take the new image and I will do a checksum on that, and we can see they are different. Wait, no, that's not proof it doesn't work. That's because I booted the disk. I just remembered that the Mac actually writes to the disk when you boot it. I don't know why, maybe it saves the time or something. I'm gonna rewrite the disk in this drive, which means, so I need to blank it, write it again, and then read it back to be able to properly compare. So one more write, and one more read. And now we should be able to see that the checksums match. So if this is BAB, yes. That is what I was expecting to see. So there we go. The original image and the new image, exactly the same. And there it is. How you can write Mac disks using a PC floppy drive and a Greaseweazle. Hopefully that helps people get an idea of how this setup works and why it is still totally viable, and we can even confirm the validity of the data. So this is how I will be writing any Mac disks going forward. I don't think an applesauce is necessary for this. It might even be possible to use this setup for an Apple II drive, as long as you don't want to use it with the, half dozen Spiradisk format disks. But that's a totally different topic that I might cover later. But for now, hopefully that will let you know that you can use a Greaseweazle for this. As a sidebar, if you try this yourself, it would be really helpful if you could post about your experiences with this on the GitHub issue that I'll go ahead and link below, where it would be really helpful if you could post which drives you're able to test and whether or not they worked with a bulk eraser, because we're trying to build up somewhat of a list of compatible drives for this so that we know which ones will work. And as I mentioned, I think in general that would be the ideal list of drives to use with a Greaseweazle, because they are less likely to distort the data for other systems as well. So please do drop a comment there if you try this out. But again, I'm going to heavily recommend that you use a bulk disk eraser, because I don't think this really works unless you do that, just because of the weird clock speeds and maybe weak erase passes that these drives do. But it totally works. Well, if you found this video to be helpful, you may want to subscribe to be notified when I release another one. If you want to help support the channel, I am on Patreon. But for now, that's it, and I will see you next time.